Well, did Europe just take a big step to eliminate personal freedoms and free speech with the passage and the now enforcement of the Digital Services Act? European Union Commissioner Terry Breton says this will strengthen democracy by protecting you from dangerous online content. Listen.
Today, the Digital Services Act, the so-called DSA, becomes legally enforceable for very large online platforms and search engines. These systemic platforms play a very, very important role on our daily life. And it is really the time now for Europe, for us, to set our own rules. The DSA is here to protect free speech against arbitrary decisions, and at the same time, to protect our citizens and democracies against illegal content.
Well, David Thunder is our next guest, and he says this is an attack on free speech and liberty. David is a researcher and lecturer in political philosophy and joins us now, and who writes on his Substack all about freedom. Thought you were the perfect guest to come on and talk about this. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Clayton. Great to be here.
So, David, can you explain to our audience exactly what the Digital Services Act is, and now it is fully enforceable by the European Commission?
Sure. The Digital Services Act is a law that has been introduced by the European Union and that was basically planned and promoted by the current president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, as well as Thierry Breton, the European Internal Market Commissioner. And basically the goal of this law is to update current regulations of the European Union of online content, the regulation specifically of illegal content such as misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and child pornography, and those kinds of issues. So that's basically the goal of the legislation, is to clamp down on illegal content on the internet.
And who gets to decide what is illegal content? What is the governing body that's going to be sitting in a room deciding what content is safe for us and is legal?
Well, the jurisdiction or the competent authorities will be divided between the European Commission and those that it nominates on one hand, and the national member states, the member states of the European Union on the other. It'll be a divided authority. But when it comes to the large social media companies such as Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Google, the very large ones, which are defined as very large online platforms, the European Commission will be responsible for policing issues like hate speech and disinformation. So personally, I find this to be very worrying because it puts in law, in European law, the principle that very vague categories such as disinformation and hate speech that are notoriously vulnerable to politicization will effectively be enforced at a Europe-wide level through an army of fact checkers that are endorsed and legitimated by the European Commission. So basically, we're handing our freedom of expression to a European bureaucracy to basically, what they could do is they can contact a service provider or an online platform, and they can flag up content that they consider to be illegal. It could be hate speech, for example, or else it could be disinformation. And once they flag that, then the service provider or the platform is obligated in law to take down that content.
Wow.
Right. So that has huge implications for freedom of expression, because essentially petty bureaucrats who are running these fact-checking organizations will be deciding in conjunction with the European Commission what counts as acceptable and unacceptable speech on the internet.
Well, Thierry Breton, he says in a series of tweets to kind of clarify the position on this. He's like, don't worry, you have nothing to worry about here. We're not going to do anything nefarious at all. Just reading through his string of tweets on this, he says, my services and I will thoroughly enforce the DSA, and fully use our new powers to investigate and sanction platforms where warranted. Comply with the DSA is not a punishment, it's an opportunity, David, for platforms to reinforce their trustworthiness. if I ever heard like something written by a politician, I mean, that is like the perfect sentence. It's an opportunity for platforms to reinforce their trustworthiness. Child protection will be an enforcement priority, as will be fighting disinformation, including pro-Russian propaganda, in particular as we are entering a period of elections in Europe. So they're going to be on the lookout for any sort of pro-Russian propaganda. They fully want to be in the tank, I guess, promoting a proxy war in Ukraine. I don't know, but who gets to decide what is pro-Russian propaganda?
Well, this is the issue. The fundamental issue with these sorts of laws is they take these kind of nebulous categories that sound very innocent to a lot of people, like disinformation or hate speech, and they enshrine them as principles of law that then must be interpreted by public officials and bureaucrats and judges. And of course, the issue is, as we've seen over the last few years, concepts like disinformation can be very easily interpreted to advance a particular polemical political vision of reality. So we saw, for example, the lab leak theory or a hypothesis about the virus, about the coronavirus, that was clamped down on by Facebook
Right.
based on the idea that it was disinformation or misinformation. And later on, now it's almost a consensus position among many experts that in fact the lab leak theory is extremely plausible and probable. So that was one example. Another example was the vaccines that we saw. Okay, with vaccine efficacy, anyone who questioned whether vaccines could block transmission, a lot of them were clamped down on as purveyors of disinformation. And of course, it turned out that the COVID vaccines, failed to stop transmission. And I could go on and cite lots of other examples of things that were considered disinformation at the time by official sources. And later on, science moved on, and suddenly we realized that these were actually, these were true. They were not disinformation. So politicians, public officials, political organizations, people in power will use these categories to advance their own narratives. And the net effect of this kind of act, this Digital Services Act, is to empower a bureaucracy to go around protecting the official narrative that is favored by the European Union, the European Commission, on issues like the Ukraine war with Russia, issues like any kind of future pandemic, and issues like transgender ideology and politics. All of these issues, instead of being just fought out in the public sphere in a democratic manner, we're going to have basically an army of bureaucrats, of fact checkers, telling us what the correct position is in advance.
I mean, it sounds like a Trojan horse plan to really, to stick these bureaucrats into every faction of our online and digital lives, from digital surveillance, of digital, ID systems being set up, with the Dia app in Ukraine, going cashless, removing us from any sort of a cash-based society, making sure everything is being monitored and watched at all times by the. I mean, it feels very much like 1984. Or almost reminds me of like that famous Apple ad from the Super Bowl many, many moons ago, against IBM. It's just like this black and white face on a wall that's controlling all of us. And it's terrifying. And if you think about the largest purveyors of misinformation during COVID, during the Ukraine war, have been the official narratives. The biggest purveyors of propaganda, the biggest liars, as Senator Rand Paul in the United States has said, the biggest liars are the United States government. They're the biggest perpetrators of propaganda. So they are going to be the purveyors of truth?
Well, this is the issue, of course. I mean, the uncomfortable truth that some people don't like to accept, but it's an obvious truth, is that putting someone in a position of power or authority does not guarantee that they'll get things right. They're all human, and we're all human. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have. It doesn't matter if you've been appointed by the European Commission. You can get things badly wrong. And people have gotten things badly wrong in the highest positions of power and authority. And one of the most notorious examples is their enthusiastic advocacy of lockdowns, which we're now seeing have created devastating effects in society that we'll be suffering for generations.
Hallelujah.
Including educational deficits for young people, psychological trauma from isolation and loneliness, untreated illnesses, and the list goes on. But I think, yes, I agree that in a sense this particular Digital Services Act is a Trojan horse in the sense that it's dressed up in the language of, we want to go against child pornography. We want to make sure that information is kind of responsibly used, and we want more transparency and so on. But in reality, as I said, essentially what it does is it puts ordinary users of Twitter and Facebook at the mercy of faceless bureaucrats, not only in the social media companies now, but also in a government organization that can then instruct the social media companies. And by the way, they have enormous enforcement powers because they can fine social media companies up to 6% of their annual turnover, annual global turnover, for failing to comply with their policies or not taking sufficient action against, disinformation or hate speech and so on. So I think that we are facing a really possibly dystopian future in the European Union regarding, freedom of expression. And maybe the one bright cloud, the little lining in the cloud, the bright lining in the grey cloud, is that Article 11 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is on freedom of expression, says that European citizens have the right to receive and impart information without interference by public authorities. So that remains in place. So I think we may be facing a legal battle very soon, and hopefully there will be these bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, will be taken to account for this really draconian assault on freedom of expression. Maybe even using existing European law this Charter of Fundamental Rights could be a weapon to use against this legislation.
Well, I mean, if you try to go to rt.com, russiatoday.com, if you live in the European Union, good luck. You won't be able to access it unless you use unless you're using a VPN. So if you're trying to access certain websites in the European Union right now, good luck. You're going to find a lot of it is already blocked. So they're already in violation of getting, of this and getting information freely and openly to the citizens of the European Union. I want to point you to one article, though, in this Digital Services Act that stood out to me going through it, which was Article 91, which says, in times of crisis, there might be a need for certain specific measures to be taken urgently by providers of very large online platforms. So think pandemic, think war, whatever they want, climate, some sort of a climate lockdown. In addition to measures they would need to be taking in view of their other obligations under this regulation. In that regard, a crisis should be considered to occur when extraordinary circumstances occur that can lead to a serious threat to public security or public health. And of course, they could use this as an umbrella to do really draconian things, no?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not entirely clear on what, the extra powers that they give, because it seems to me they already have incredible powers
Right.
to, because they can demand that these companies provide annual reports on their policing of disinformation and hate speech, and then they can fine them up to 6% of their annual income or turnover. That to me is already an incredible power to be given to faceless bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats. But now they also have a clause in there that says that they can declare an emergency, and in the event of declaring an emergency, then they can basically instruct these platforms to censor any kind of information that might be deemed a threat to public order, or it might be deemed a public threat. In a sense, they're trying to cover all their bases. I'm not sure from a legal perspective why they need to be able to declare emergencies in this particular case, because it seems like they already have a lot of power. But overall, it's clear that any citizen who cares about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and indeed the future of a free way of life should be very, very, very concerned about the Digital Services Act. And I think our conversation here could be a good way of galvanizing public awareness of this issue, because the act is in place. It's going to probably be applied. But hopefully, the very fact that we're thinking about it and that citizens are aware of it will make them seek other avenues for finding information and not blindly trust whatever they see on the internet, especially when they know that it's been filtered and fact checked by these, these bureaucrats. So awareness is one way to combat these sorts of authoritarian measures.
Right.
On the ground, grassroots, people on the ground organizing, Facebook, WhatsApp groups, whatever it takes to bypass these sorts of mechanisms of control and censorship.
David, great to have you on the show. Thanks for being a first-time guest
Thank you.
here on Redacted. Great analysis, and we look forward to further coverage on this as the days unfold. Thanks again.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.